Hope and persistence. You may already know the Apostle Paul. He was the one persecuting the first Christians. He was infamous for his cruelty and the number of people that he jailed. One day when he was in the midst of his brutal attacks on the road to Damascus, he was struck blind by a bright light. He fell down and heard the voice of Jesus. Saul, that was his Hebrew name. Saul, why are you persecuting me? He was instructed to go to a particular person's house where he was taught about the life of Christ. He regained his sight and became the #1 evangelist for the Christian faith, starting house churches in Italy, Greece, Turkey, and beyond. His letters to the Corinthians and Romans, for example, were words of guidance for the church in the first century and for Christians today. Paul is the one who encourages us to be all things to all people so that we can connect and communicate across boundaries. Today's story that Jack Bazitis read so well depicts Paul at the Areopagus in Greece. The Areopagus was a valley filled with statues to the Greek gods. It was a place of introducing new gods and new philosophies, a place of Socratic discourse, as well as a place to try court cases. Whether Paul was there to defend himself in court or to preach and change hearts is not clear. What is clear is that he met his audience exactly where they were and started his message there. Paul used an existing Greek statue as a segue to introduce a new god. He gave a name, Yahweh, to a statue that was labeled to an unknown God. Agnostos Theos. That's where we get the term agnostic, not knowing. They may have created this statue to hedge their bets in case they missed one God and did not want to offend, or it may have been a representation of their persistence in seeking for the God they knew that they needed. Even in the midst of dozens of gods, there was a sense of longing for one who would accompany them in sadness, multiply their joy, and affirm their inherent goodness. He connected their search for an unknown God with the God that he knew through Jesus, Yahweh, the one God, not one God among many. Both Paul and the Greeks were hopeful. The Greeks persevered in their attempts to know the unknowable God, hoping that this God would be revealed to them to fill in the gaps left by the pantheon of gods that they already knew. Paul was hopeful that the Greeks would understand his passionate offering of an answer to their hopes of the God in Jesus. He persevered in order to fulfill all of their hopes. I remember a story from my psychology training. It's probably more apocryphal than factual, about the relationship between hope and perseverance. 2 children were part of an experiment about hopefulness that was scored on the basis of heart rate, dilation of pupils, muscle tension, and facial expression. First, the 2 were put into separate rooms filled with good things to eat. They scored equally in hopefulness. Then they were introduced to rooms filled with a variety of games and puzzles. Again, they scored equally in hopefulness. The experimenters talked with the children and found them both eager to continue with the process. The final rooms were each filled with horse manure and a bunch of farm implements. The first child sat dejectedly in the corner looking at this scene. Needless to say, his hopefulness score dropped by about 80%. The second child continued to have a high score. The researchers saw through the glass that she was fervently digging through the pile of manure with a pitchfork. They asked the second child, what was she doing? She said excitedly, "There's got to be a pony in here somewhere." She was going to keep looking until she found something good in the midst of all that excrement. We all know at least one person like this, the one who perseveres even when it looks like there's no way to overcome the roadblocks and obstacles on the way to a goal. We know a person who keeps sending in manuscripts to publishers despite multiple rejections, or the person who continues to seek a life partner despite past failed relationships, or the one who perseveres in going to work at the hospital, even knowing that some of the patients will die. This kind of perseverance is a characteristic of hope. The amazing thing is that persistence can actually come before or after an awareness of hope. The little girl digging through the manure may have had an inherent or God-given hopefulness. But just as easily, she may have developed hopefulness because of her willingness to persevere in the face of a pile of dung. Every day, you can persist in making one more phone call, baking another loaf of bread, teaching one more class to your kids, opening one more bill, or changing one more diaper. All of that adds up. When you see yourself as someone who perseveres, you will find yourself hoping. You may not be pitchforking your way through manure to a pony, but you will hope for something positive at the end of your persistent actions. We see this over and over again through the actions of the Community Renewal Society in Chicago. When you're involved in the activities of talking to representatives, writing proposals, getting signatures, rewriting proposals, and gathering with others for education and demonstrations, you experience how persistence pays off, and it makes you hopeful. I encourage you to talk to Lindsay Hammond, our church moderator, about the state bills that she has worked on, especially the fair tax bill that was passed just a year ago in May. Now, in conjunction with the Coalition to End Money Bond, CRS is working to monitor the bond process in the courts to minimize the number of people incarcerated before trial because of their inability to pay. You can look on our website at the Take Action page for information about getting involved in these activities. Our perseverance in making systemic change is a powerful tool of hope and expressing compassion. The statue to an unknown God represented the Greeks' desire to be known and cared for as much as their desire to know that God. They were not satisfied with the Areopagus filled with statues of demanding gods who were disinterested and distant. Paul met them in that place and drew on the Greek philosopher Epimenides from 600 years earlier by calling the God Yahweh the one in whom we live and move and have our being. He made a bridge to what he knew to be true about God. The God who made the world and everything in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands. In our present time, we do well to remember that God does not live in the buildings that we build. God is present with us from birth to death. God is present with you now in whatever room you are. And God is even present in your online meetings. In other words, God is in human wombs and tombs, rooms and Zooms. Sorry. Jesus promised his disciples the presence of the Spirit, an additional paraclete or advocate, a comforter, helper, intercessor, to abide with us and to give us the capacity to love as Jesus did. The Spirit of this God is the one we and the Greeks were longing for. I will say that this was the piece that Paul missed in his preaching. He neglected to tell them that searching for God, persevering in the quest for God, doesn't result in attaining a relationship with the Creator. The truth is, it is the one God, Yahweh, who is persisting in seeking a relationship with us. God is the one pursuing, pushing, trying again and again for us to welcome the gifts of divine grace and love and hope. We do not have to chase God and persevere in proving ourselves worthy to be loved. God perseveres in drawing near to us to prove that we are already loved and lovable. It is God's persistent activity that matters the most. As promised, God will come toward us, abide with us, bring comfort and hope to us. Our activity is a response to God's, following the commandment to love one another as we have been loved. Amen.